How does an Air Force officer raise $100 million and become a space tech founder?
Well, I had an unusual career in that sense. Like my first job out of school was definitely going to ADFA as a Air Force cadet, so the Defence Academy. And from there I went and worked in a flying squadron. So I was the NJO and then acting CENJO. So keeping the planes in the air. But I always felt I was getting away with being an Air Force officer. It's not really who I am underneath. I don't follow rules that well. And I'm sort of more creative. So a couple of other classmates and I got promoted to the head of our class, but I left sort of 18 months after that. Transitioned to the reserve, did another 15 years in the specialist reserve. So all up, I think I did close to 30 years as an Air Force officer. But I was very much somebody who stays close to defence. But it's not my career. I've got classmates that are like VCDF and chief of joint operations and whatever, but it's not me. I'm much more creative than that. And I wear weird shoes, so I couldn't possibly be in a uniform.
Yeah, so drawing on that experience, how did that impact you as a leader? Even though you say that you weren't quite aligned with that sort of lifestyle, how did that affect your ability to lead a team?
Well, you get comfortable being you get comfortable being in charge of people. At the same time, you also get comfortable taking orders from others and being a good follower. I think to be a good leader, you kind of want to also be a good follower, which means you can handle not being in charge and backing up a leader and trying to help out and all that sort of stuff. And I guess, that first job, notionally I had like 100 technicians and whatever else that theoretically reported through a chain to me. In practice, of course, they had sergeants, flight sergeants and warrant officers that helped out a lot. You don't want to ever kid yourself that you're actually totally in charge, but you're actually comfortable making decisions and working with people and being accountable for that. Because the big thing with people is they're not minions to order around. They're people that you're responsible for is kind of the insight.
Okay.
And making sure that they have productive things to do and they kind of enjoy coming to work each day in a simple sense.
Would you have gone down that pathway if you knew what you knew now of the defence as opposed to the civilian pathway?
I have absolutely no regrets about going to defence. Most of my friends are still defence or ex-defence type people, whatever. That it's a bit like going to uni, except it's a much more intense version of uni because you're living and working with these people, every minute of your day, and then you tend to bump into them over your career as well. So it's a very intense thing. But that said, I had a great time, and I don't know very many people that went to ADFA with me that actually regret it. So it's they're all good choices. Life's a smorgasbord. You can't do everything. I don't have that many regrets in terms of things where you go, gee, I wish I hadn't done that. That was a waste of 3 years of my life. Most things you go, I could have done something different, but yeah.
Can you walk us through the early days of founding Skykraft?
Yeah, so I guess the whole thing started when the dean of faculty over there, called the rector, squirreled away a little bit of his budget to be forward-looking and decided that cyber and space were two areas that were going to grow in the future. And this was back 2013 sort of timeframe. And so these areas got kicked off, and they recruited a professor to lead them, and then academics who were kind of semi-aligned joined into those groups. And so we did that. We started building some satellites. Decided that there should be it'd be useful to have a commercial arm that did stuff at the side of the university, and so that's kind of where Skykraft came from. 4 of us founded it and spun it out of the university. 2 of us are still with the company, Doug, the chief engineer, and myself. And the other 2 co-founders have a big role to play in getting the company to where it is now.
Out of all your co-founders, how did you decide who was going to be the CEO?
That's always a tricky one. There's the secret of Skykraft kind of is that we actually have a lot of depth and sort of emotional maturity going on. So we don't, although you have those traditional sorts of roles as a CEO, there's a chief engineer, I'm chief innovation officer. In reality, we all talk very openly about each other's jobs and what we should and shouldn't be doing and how we might handle things. So it's probably better to think of it as there's somebody who's doing business management and being a bit of a front for the company. And then there's people who are actually delivering on some of those sorts of things, but it's not a traditional hierarchy in the way we tend to operate. that sort of makes sense.
Yeah.
You know, like we employ a CEO today. He's actually the dean of faculty that spun out or helped us spin out the company and set up the space group. Who, to show how long things go back in Canberra, he started. He's an ANU graduate. His PhD's from ANU. His undergrad's from University of Sydney. But he started over at ADFA as a brand new associate lecturer when I was in third year as an undergrad, and we've known each other ever since. But he gets to make all those day-to-day CEO decisions, but it's very much a team effort, is the way I look at those things.
And so with that evolution, as you refer to Michael,
Yep.
there, how did that evolution happen where you were in a position where were you looking for a specific leader? Were you looking for some skills that the team didn't have at that moment? And what were you looking for in particular?
We've been sort of living without a CEO, managing director for a little while. The chairman, Skates, had been standing in as executive chairman, so doing the CEO job at the same time. But that was only ever a stopgap. It wasn't really what he wanted to be doing. He was doing it as a favour for the company. And then strangely enough, one of our potential investors offered to help us find a CEO, and we were kind of a little bit allergic to that because we didn't want to get the wrong person. If you get somebody who's too much of an MBA business type, they can absolutely mess up a company. So Doug actually suggested during a board meeting, what about Michael? And Michael had left being dean of faculty, whatever, and was just cruising around Canberra doing a few things. And so I texted him and said, "Oh, you're free for coffee in the morning?" And that was we had coffee on that Friday morning, and then he made a few calls over the weekend. And by the end of the weekend, he'd accepted the job before it even been offered it. But it's worked out really well, and he's very, very enthusiastic, and the team's great. Yep.
What were some of the leadership qualities that made Michael good for the role? Were there a few specific things or traits that he had?
Primarily what we're after, I mean, you want somebody who understands the company and is able to think laterally about where the value is, how you want to harvest the value, all that sort of stuff. You don't want somebody following a formula they learned during MBA. I'm not a big fan of MBAs. During an MBA, business is really important, but I'm much more of a fan of Charlie Munger's sort of view that there's a bunch of fields that you want to have a first year, maybe even half a first year university understanding of, everything from psychology to business to finance to accounting, whatever. But that if you study them too much, then they actually get in the way of good decision making. I'd highly recommend reading Charlie Munger's book, which is just a collection of his speeches, because he does a really good job of explaining why that's true and why he and Warren Buffett. So he's Warren. For those who don't know, he's Warren Buffett's investment partner. They have a very different view of the world to most people in the finance markets. Yet it actually works for them. They've got an outstanding track record. So clearly they're not wrong. This doesn't mean everyone else is wrong, but it does mean that there's an angle in what they say. And being a bit of a polymath, having a first year's understanding of a whole heap of fields is actually very useful.
Can you walk us through sort of the ideation process for Skykraft? Because you had the technology from UNSW, and then how did you connect that to a customer need or a customer problem?
So we were kind of looking around for what the company should do. We were very clear that building gadgets is not a good path to a sustainable company. You don't want to be in the position of building a better mousetrap. It's not really what the world normally needs. And that in space, all of the money is in services. It's not in launch. It's not in building satellites. It's about delivering services. And so we were looking around for a market niche. And I guess the big insight with ideation, whatever you want to call it, I'd recommend looking at Peter Thiel's sort of work and his understanding of this, the 0 to 1 book. It's a series of lectures that he gave at Stanford that was, in effect, notes that one of his students took that they turned into a book. The student did a really good job of writing the notes up and putting them on the internet. But it's Peter Thiel's, again, a very interesting character because he thinks for himself. And his description of how you make money out of anything in life really is that you create value, call it X dollars, and then you get to keep Y% of that. And so if X or Y is 0 or negative, then you don't have a business. But you really what you're after is to create a lot of value and then keep a decent portion of it. And I would always argue from my personality type that you're better off to go for a very large X, create a lot of value and keep even a modest portion of it. just make sure that X% doesn't drop to, sorry, Y% doesn't drop to zero. And that's actually really good because every time you're creating value, you're actually making the world a better place as well. So if you're doing charity, whatever, charity's not really about giving away your money. It's not sort of Bill Gates saying he's going to give away 99% of his fortune. The far better thing is to make your fortune delivering massive value to others. If you keep 1% of what you've created and you become a billionaire, that means you've created, $1 trillion or $100 million. Worth of value for the world. Yeah, and that's actually far more than you could ever give away. Yeah, so most of your charity is in your daily work. So X times Y.
Was there a specific story of how you landed on air traffic management as opposed to some other space related industry?
It's kind of serendipitous. It turned out that the aviation community was kind of looking at the ability to do ADS-B from space, and there was one company looking at doing it, but the commercial terms weren't fantastic, and there's a number of limitations in that service. And so we sort of went, okay, maybe we can launch a competing service. And I immediately did the numbers, and it turns out we could absolutely do it cheaper and better than the potential incumbent was doing it, which is a good start. The only problem that I had was that they were hosted on the Iridium NEXT satellite. So they're a hosted payload on a 15-year live satellite system. And so the problem was they were going to have a stranded asset on orbit. So they were trying to make back the money that it cost to build and launch the satellites effectively. But once the satellites are up, that's kind of a sunk cost. And so if we steal their market and they go bankrupt, somebody will just buy them out of bankruptcy for cents on the dollar and sell the service for what they can get. And the problem is then we go bankrupt second. So that wasn't a good business to me. So we had to sit down and work out what else we could do. And again, you ask sort of how does an Air Force officer come up with a business idea. One of the things that I've always looked at in my career, I was very, after working on aeroplanes, I worked in electronic warfare. And so you're always interested in not what a system's designed to do, but what do they actually do? And in electronic warfare, what you're always doing is making sure you can mess with an adversary system so that the weapon that they thought was going to do wonderful things doesn't actually do anything useful for them. And so I basically worked out we could mess with the communication systems on aeroplanes, and we could inject false information into their voice circuit, and we could eavesdrop on their conversations from a long way away. And that this actually was something we could do to help the pilots out and the air traffic controllers by giving them communication over the ocean from a satellite. When they thought they had to talk to a tower on a hill, 100 miles away, they could talk to a satellite, 1,000 miles away, and it would be fine. And you can very quickly do the numbers and prove the physics works. I always go back to the physics, not to what everybody does. And the physics stacks up really easily. So you go, okay, we can do this. And that's how we basically brought this system around. And it turns out we're the first ones in the world to really take it seriously and push hard on it. There were some thoughts on doing it like 25 years ago that died out. And then, we got lucky after that Air Services picked it up. MH370 had disappeared around the same sort of time. And the Singaporeans were very interested in talking to planes over the ocean because when it disappeared, it was out of VHF contact. So it didn't have press-to-talk communication with air traffic control. And so nobody noticed it was missing for half an hour or so. And again, it probably still would have disappeared. There's not much you can do to interfere with that, but at least they would have known instantly that it was gone, and there wouldn't have been a temptation to make it disappear like that. And that got an agenda item into World Radio Conference. The International Telecommunications System or Union changed its rules so that we could do VHF transmissions from space because this is a heavily regulated field, and we're now just getting the last little bits of ICAO, the Civil Aviation Organization, the UN body that does aviation, the last few little documents written there, and then the system will be coming into service.
Who actually is your client? Are you selling to airlines or defence, or who are you selling to?
So the main client is the equivalent of Air Services or the FAA, or every country has one of these. Airways New Zealand, those sorts of things. And so it's the Air Traffic Control Organisation, and except in America, everywhere else in the world, they charge fees for Qantas and Virgin to fly through their airspace, a few $100s an hour. And that pays for the air traffic controller, for the navigation aids and so on. And so we sell to them, and then they charge the airlines and therefore the airline passengers. But our whole business plan is in effect that we save them money. So we lower the cost of air travel, not increase it. And we make it marginally more efficient and so on. Going back to my point around creating a lot of value and helping the world that way. Although a lot of the money for this comes from places like the North Atlantic, the London to New York type route and every other city pair in Europe and North America, most of the benefit actually accrues in the developing world where they don't have infrastructure. Pacific Islands, places like Papua New Guinea, Africa, and so on, where you don't have the telecommunications barriers, you don't have power, you might not even have sufficient law and order and whatever to actually put assets on the ground and expect them to stay there. And we can provide first-rate air traffic services from space cheaper than they can do it on the ground. And a lot of places, especially PNG, there's people that are completely reliant on air to get around. Pacific Islands are the same. People that have a very low US dollars per month income, and they're completely reliant on air travel. So the cost really matters to them.
So you were just talking about all these problems that you're looking to solve, but you come from a very strong technical background. So for you personally, what's more exciting, being able to play with that technology and deploy it, or solving these problems for the world?
The reality is it's both, right? If I was playing with technology to make a more addictive poker machine, that wouldn't be very fulfilling. But likewise, if I was washing dishes in a soup kitchen, that's kind of worthwhile, but not very satisfying in terms of technical. So it's the combination of the two. It's in effect building Lego for a good purpose is kind of the technical geek's description of it.
Have you considered building the satellites for other applications as well? Like, can they be modular once they're in space?
Once they're in space, they kind of are what they are. I mean, they're software reconfigurable. They're not hardware reconfigurable. So, a bit like your iPhone or whatever, it's got the circuits in it that it's ever going to have, and we're certainly not bringing them back to update them. The launch cost is the same as the satellite cost, if not higher. So you certainly don't want to think of the asset, the satellite as being the precious thing. It's actually the launch that dimensions it. They're software upgradable, so we can ask the radios to do slightly different things once they're launched, and we do that now. But there are future markets and other places we can go, but it's important not to get ahead of yourself. Don't get distracted. We are 100% focused on delivering the air traffic management solution first, and then we'll sort of, I've got a list of tasks that we could go after, and some of them are better than others and more attractive than others. But we can certainly do other services later. But air traffic management is our number one thing. And once we get that done, we've succeeded. And then everything else is a bonus. Doug and I are both very motivated, and Michael. So the three executive leaders, if you like, are very motivated just to make the system work. We're not really doing it to get rich as a shareholder. We don't want to buy yachts in the Mediterranean. We just want to do cool things. We're all in our sort of mid to late 50s. Getting rich is not really the game. It's like it's nice to have, but it's you really just want to tick the box and do something worthwhile. I won. It's far more like climbing Mount Everest. You do it because it's there, not because it makes you famous.
Fair.
Edmund Hillary got famous doing it. Nobody else does.
Starting a company is a pretty big risk. You've said before that fortune favors the brave. What does bravery look like to you, like in the early days?
Bravery is a code word for stupidity. Starting the company, you start off with these ideas that wouldn't this be cool, wouldn't it be great? But there's a lot of downsides in starting a company. There's a lot of suffering. There's a lot of risk. It becomes all consuming. And you always should expect to lose. You want to be. You wouldn't do this unless you're optimistic and expected to win. But the reality is, you've got to not kid yourself and say, actually, this is not likely to be a good way to make money or to succeed, because it's a bit like starting restaurants. Most of them fail. Most startups fail. So you've got to accept that. Believe that you're in this minority that are going to succeed, but it's got to come from some sort of deeper drive. A little bit like somebody trying to win a gold medal at the Olympics. Chances are you're not going to succeed. Most people can't. But it doesn't mean you shouldn't do it. You should be. You should be sober when you actually look at the odds.
What are the most needed traits for a startup founder, do you think?
There's a combination. So the natural one that people trot out first is grit, or the ability to persist. So, to use a sort of a running analogy, this is kind of like what happens 32 kilometres into a marathon. You've been running along all day. It's been kind of working hard, but suddenly at 32 kilometres, somebody drops a piano on your shoulders. My advice to people planning on doing a marathon is always have a reason in your head where at 32 kilometres you are going to keep running, you're not going to walk, because you won't be able to think of a good reason at the time, because there isn't a good reason. You should actually stop and walk. So you've got to have this drive, whatever it is, that's going to get you through that moment. And you don't think about the finish line. You're not holding on for the last 10 kilometres to the finish. That's 40, 50, 60 minutes away, depending on how fast you're running. You're just dealing with it one step at a time. It's just don't quit this second, don't quit this second, don't quit this second. I had one some years ago in Boston where I desperately needed to go to the bathroom halfway through the marathon. And all I did was tell myself, you don't need to, just bypass this one and go to the next one. Bypass this one, go to the next one. And after 5 or 10 kilometres, the feeling went away, and I got to the finish and I wasn't desperately looking for a bathroom. I didn't stop. I ran 5 seconds faster than my qualifier. I did 2:45 flat. If I'd stopped for a bathroom stop, wouldn't have happened. You forever regret those where you do stop. So you need that grit. But the other one is probably honesty. So everybody sort of remembers the sort of narcissistic, I'm the greatest thing ever. I can do wonderful things. Type founders, and some of them are sort of famous around the world. I'm not convinced everybody understands exactly what drives each of the various super rich founders like those. The Jeff Bezoses, the Elon Musks, the Mark Zuckerbergs, whatever, the Bill Gateses. They're all different animals in their own right. None of them are rational. No rational person would set out to make $1 billion. 10, 20, $50 million would be fine. Go and buy a nice yacht and sail the Mediterranean. A bigger yacht doesn't make you incrementally more happy, but they're driven by something else, right? But that honesty about an ability to actually look at yourself and to value others, I think, is actually really quite important. Some people get away without it, but I actually think you're better off to be reasonably mature and, if you like, play nicely with others. I suspect that it puts a cap on the upside, and we remember those standout billionaires rather than the people that make $50 or $100 million. But I actually think the people who do reasonably well are actually happier and more satisfied people. So you want to be honest about what you're doing, and that actually then means you can build teams really well. Because it's not all about you. You can actually treat people well.
I'm curious, you were talking about the marathon and how you need to get to a point where you just convince yourself not to stop. Mm-hmm. But on the other hand, there's this classic joke of like most gamblers quit right before they're about to win. Yep. So how do you balance that, knowing that persistence is obviously very important, but at a certain point, sunk cost fallacy, when should someone give up?
So I guess part of it is that honesty as well, that there's some people have started a business where it obviously isn't going to work. The writing's on the wall. It turns out you pursued a market that's completely illusionary. There's that kind of ability to actually look at the odd, look at what's going on. But I actually think the people that succeed quit much later down that track than they should. If that sort of makes sense. So if you were rational, you should have quit. And the people that succeed go beyond what a rational person would do. And I mean, from a mathematically rational person, right? That the people we've got to remember, there's a selection bias in finding people that have succeeded in business. We don't count all the people that failed. We remember the Jeff Bezoses, whatever, of the world that have actually succeeded and made a lot of money. You don't even know the name of all the 500 people that did exactly what he did and didn't work. You want to, I think in reality what happens is that the people that succeed are not doing the rational thing. They're going beyond the rational thing. This is that sticking at it. Like I said, at 32 kilometers into a marathon, you probably should stop and walk. It's a crazy thing to be doing. But there's an advantage in going beyond what a rational person would do. And that actually, that actually puts people into that category where you notice them because they stand out, because most people don't do it. So we should be, like I sort of say, a little bit careful of trying to copy the people that stand out or come easily to mind as successes. Because we're not counting all the people that didn't succeed. Yeah, and it's very bad for your mental health to push that hard. It's like it is all or nothing. Yeah, yeah.
What are your motivations? What like keeps you pushing on day to day?
Most of it is for a long time it was don't quit. Yeah, just like endure. Yeah, it was that that you're at 32 kilometers, just take it one step at a time, one day at a time, get through, do the most important things that you can get your mind around that day, and then wake up tomorrow and do it again, and trust that eventually there'll be some brightness on the other side. Yeah, so it's a little bit like Tom Hanks in Castaway, where he's just persisting for no particular reason, and then eventually, things got to work out at the end of the happy ending to somewhat happy ending to the movie. If he delivers the ice skates, or no, it wasn't ice skates. It was the welded things to the girl that was clearly going to become the love of his life, after his wife had remarried and whatever else, because he was lost at sea for years and whatever. But that sort of hope that one day things are going to get better, that we will get through this, is kind of what drives you on. There is no secret to it. It is just suffering for the sake of it. I think Elon Musk was famous for saying, a startup is like standing on the edge of an abyss chewing glass, something like that. It's like he's more graphic than most people, but it's kind of true. Like there's a whole lot of suffering and not much in the way of, it's not all sweetness and light and champagne cocktails in a rooftop bar.
I think that quote was actually...
It's a whole lot of 2 a.m. It's a whole lot of people working till 2 a.m. when you don't want to.
It was about being a CEO, that quote, where you're getting all the worst problems. If someone could solve that problem, it wouldn't be coming to you as the CEO. Yeah.
Yep.
Going back to sort of maybe like the management of Skykraft day to day, there's a lot riding on like the launches of satellites and that aspect of your business. How do you balance sort of like not wanting to fail and stuff up a launch with also like a move fast and break things approach?
That's always a difficult balance, and ultimately it gets thrust on you. So traditional rocket launches where you buy the whole rocket, you can slide the launch to the right, so you can delay. But we've always done ride share, which basically means it's like catching the city bus. The bus leaves without you, so you've just got to make the most of where you're at. And go for robustness over absolute performance is kind of my insight to all this. I always used to tell final year project students, so students doing their final year engineering project, that this is a 12-month project. And I'd always say that a high distinction starts with a pass at mid-year. Because so many students come in now, I'm going to do a great job on my thesis project, and they're thinking about getting a HD at the end of the year, and they never start because they're just trying to get everything perfect. Whereas the ones that succeed really well get in, have a go, and each week they increase where they're at. They get to a pass by mid-year. So by mid-year, they could submit their work at the end of the year and still pass. That's what I mean. It's not a get a pass at mid-year. It's get a pass for the end of the year at mid-year, and then it compounds. And so they very quickly ratchet up from a pass to a credit to a distinction to a HD. And it kind of goes like that. The students that have got something that would be a pass at mid-year are the ones that do really well. So the goal here is always build your minimum viable product. Get that initial thing out the door. Don't worry so much about the future. If possible, put features in there that you can grow, but don't worry about getting everything right to get that minimum viable product, and go for robustness. Something that'll survive. So something that'll survive contact with the real world.
You're a big proponent of being a realist. Mm-hmm. How do you manage when you're communicating, especially leading a team? How do you manage being realistic without coming across as a dick?
So normally you lead with, so the first person you should criticize is yourself. If you can do a really good job of that, then most people kind of realize that you're not being a dick. And you're always criticizing, or not even criticizing, you're always shining light on the features of the idea, never the person. So my normal starting point is to always point out, this is a stupid idea. It was mine, but I don't think we should do it that way anymore. It seemed like a good idea at the time, and it turns out it's a really dumb idea. And that is incredibly disarming. And the other angle I always put, because we always get proud of our designs, they're like our little babies and that sort of stuff, is that instead of talking about how good something is, you go, let's look at all the options and we'll choose the one that sucks the least. Yeah, because it totally changes your perspective about what you're looking at. Instead of choosing the best, choose the one that sucks the least. Because it makes you think about what are the downsides of each of the different designs rather than just what are their good features. And normally the good features talk for themselves and everyone forgets the bad features. So you just draw attention to the things that have the cognitive bias. The main one, and humor also works. Like just having fun, being constantly. I'm normally the one in the room that makes fun even when the stress is high. Just make oblique comments that are humorous without being like I'm not that funny. But you're always looking for the humor in something. You always try to be a little bit lighthearted because it stops people taking things too seriously. But at the same time, that actually loosens up your mind to find creative solutions. Yeah. And especially with brainstorming, whatever. I'll jump on this one a little bit further. With brainstorming, you don't want to start off with sensible ideas. You want to start off with really crazy ideas. So deliberately, talk about okay, let's build the satellites out of paper. Let's do this, let's do that. Let's not eat. Let's launch the satellites with a giant slingshot, whatever. It doesn't matter. The whole idea is to let go of reality and then come back to reality, because otherwise our brains are really limiting. So you always want to try to break through that mindset and come from the outside. And once you do that, everybody gets creative and everybody lets go of their personal, if you like, pride, so you don't offend people too much.
As a company, Skykraft has really shone a light on some of the success stories of interns and grads. Mm-hmm. For instance, I learned about how a couple of your grads designed the sort of the release mechanism for, I believe, your Block 2 satellites.
They weren't grads; they were interns.
Oh, sorry, interns.
Yes, that was Arthur and Grace. They didn't design it; they were in charge of testing it.
Okay.
But they came up with a quite innovative way of testing it, and I think they were both in second year at the time. Grace has moved on. She's gone to Sydney to study audio engineering, a few other things. She was doing music and engineering. And then Arthur's working for us now. So he's ANU graduate. Started with this issue.
Was there a deliberate conversation within the leadership team that we're going to put a lot of faith in our more junior level employees, or how does that come about in a company?
We've always done that. If every time we have an intern start, so I always look at it from the electrical point of view, but there's direct analogies in mechanical, whatever. But I always make it a goal that when an intern starts, their first day, they should design a circuit and push the circuit board out for manufacture, right? So there's none of this walk around, get your computer, log in, do this, do that. It's like, all that stuff takes 5 minutes. Walk down a hallway, get a photo taken for your pass, right, come back. Okay, here's your desk, here's your task, pull out your laptop and start work. Here's a Wi-Fi password sort of thing. And so the advantage of that is humans understand animals understand primacy and recency. So the first time you're exposed to something, and your most recent exposure to it. They're the two most powerful data points. And so you should never lose that primacy option because you can never get it a second time. Yeah. So you should always make sure somebody's first experience is a good one. Yeah. And they're learning to behave the way you want them to continue behaving. And our view is always, if you produce results quick enough, we don't care if it fails. It's only when you've taken 3 months to deliver it and it's delivered the day before we need it, that's when you care about it failing. Yeah. So if you fail early, it's not really a failure. You're just learning ways not to do it, to quote Edison. Yeah. Which is fine. Yeah. And you very quickly find out which interns are talented and which ones are not. Yeah. Because the good ones will learn from their mistakes. It's not that they make mistakes; they just learn really quickly. Yeah. And that's not just about intelligence. That's much more about emotional intelligence. And again, that ability to self-reflect and to see the world as it is rather than as we wish it was.
How can I, as a first-time founder, put a system in place to try and attract the best people to your company? What sort of, processes do you have to attract those A players?
We don't really have a process. We sort of worked on. We knew for a long time that we wanted to attract talent, and it's our kind of talent, right? So there's different companies are good for different people. So it's a lot of it's about finding the right fit too. So we shouldn't think of the world as a linear hierarchy. it depends on what you're looking for as to what the ranking of who the best and the worst person are, sort of thing. So the world doesn't break into a number one person in the world through to worst person in the world. Depends on the context. And I'll give an example there. Like I talk about running, right? I'm a very good runner. But when I was at ADFA, I had to do compulsory sport, and my sport was basketball. And I'm 6'3", fairly athletic. I should be quite good, and I'm really bad at basketball. After 3 years of training, I made the 7th out of 9 teams, and I was playing C grade midweek in Queanbeyan. Fourth year, I didn't have to do basketball anymore. I took up running and triathlon. And so I won the cross country. So I was the best runner in the entire academy instead of being the 54th best basketballer. And 18 months after that, I was representing the whole of defence in the UK. And I was doing about as much training as I did for basketball. Right. So this is not about being a good runner. It's about not playing basketball. So in life, you should recognise when, in fact, it's equivalent of Craig playing basketball. And if you want to keep doing it, fine, but don't expect to be rewarded for it. It's very much a hobby. You're never going to do well. Go and find the things you are good at. And part of that is getting honest feedback. So all the way through school, I'd get school reports and whatever else saying, Craig will never be any good at sport. And they were right 99% of the time, if that makes sense. And when you find those things where you are good at it, or you get rewards for it, they mean a whole lot more. Rather than what we sometimes fall into, which is every child gets a prize irrespective of how good they are. What you actually want to do is just find something that each child is individually good at and reward them for that. Because it gets a much better application of effort.
If you hire someone who's underperforming, do you always try and maybe push them into another field or something and try and find that?
You want to find out what they're good at. So half the time it's you're using somebody in the wrong way. So you've just asked them to do the wrong job. So you go, okay, do we have a job that actually suits their personality type, their way of working, whatever it is better? And sometimes you can do that. So for example, the person you want designing a product that's never existed before is quite different to the person you want designing the next generation of the Toyota Camry, right? Because somebody creative working on a Toyota Camry, you're going to build a car that breaks down a lot, right? And the secret of a Toyota Camry is it doesn't break down. It's very cost effective. There's no recalls, whatever. So you're after a very different personality type. So often you can just redeploy somebody to the right task. Other times they need to redeploy to a different company because you just don't have the kind of tasks that they're good at. But like I say, in the right context, everybody is the rock star. You just got to find the right context. This may or may not exist in your company. Sometimes people need to move on. It's fine. You can do this in a way that works. It's sometimes not what the individual wants, but you can do it in a way that gives them every opportunity to succeed going forward and to leave with their head high rather than be told they're a failure and kicked out. That's never the case. You're always just going, actually, we don't have a context that we can harvest what you're doing in. And if you're the person who's leaving, like for me, there would be nothing more soul destroying than trying to make a career as a C grade basketballer. You just constantly crap for your whole life. Like you actually want to move on and find something you are good at. That's kind of the secret. So it's painful, but it's necessary.
More broadly, as your headcount grows, how do you make sure that everyone's personally invested in the success of the company?
So we make a lot of efforts to keep the headcount low. So we deliberately do things outsourced if they make sense. So all of our machining, all of our circuit board population, all that sort of stuff gets done externally, which again keeps your headcount down. We do insist on maintaining our design control of everything. So we design everything in-house, all that sort of stuff. But the whole idea is to minimize the number of people that we need and maximize the production. So I'm never worried about people wasting money, for example. Occasionally you have to beat the accountants up for that. But the current accountant, if you like, finance manager, is very good at not optimizing for minimal cost. She's quite good at understanding that if we waste a little bit of money here and there, it's not the worst thing we can do. We could stifle people's creativity. So again, on that same basis, the first day of an intern's job, they put out a circuit board for manufacture, or they 3D print the parts that they're going to use or send it out for machining, preferably both. So 3D print a prototype to make sure it fits and then send it out to our favourite machine shops in Wodonga. I normally describe our favourite suppliers as they have 5 staff and 3 blue heeler dogs. And that's not strictly true, but it's a pretty good model of what's going on. They are just standard shops, normally owner operated, that do a really good job, and we're their only the only space company they deal with. They're not space suppliers. They build parts for trailers and for farmers and for whatever, not just for satellites. And the advantage then is that we're saving a whole heap of money because space providers are really expensive and insist on doing things to all sorts of standards that we really don't care about. And they're normally slow, whereas a machine shop, if we need something overnight, we can get it overnight. And standard stuff is like maybe a week at the outside, often 3 or 4 days. And because they're so much cheaper than a space provider would be, we can afford to overpay. So I'm always telling our finance people, this doesn't make me want to be ripped off. I'm always telling our finance people again, don't haggle on the quote. Sure, have a couple of suppliers and do test the market occasionally, but you don't need to don't put things out with 3 quotes. Just put 10% of your work to another provider and just ask yourself, what's the value for money look like? And then be open with the supplier, talk to them about if you've got a problem. And thirdly, pay their invoice the day you get it. Because most of these, 5 staff and 3 blue heelers, they're companies that run strictly on cash. They'd always like more cash in the bank. They're often a bit stretched. So, pay them the day the invoice arrives. Don't take your 14 days credit just because you can. Whereas again, the default behavior of finance people is to always pay on the last day due because they get taught that at school. Yep.
It's interesting. It's almost like you've adopted a bit of the NVIDIA playbook of really being focused on the design where where you're adding the value. But on the other hand, you're recognizing that we don't need to outsource to a TSMC where we can leverage the fact that we've got these mom and pop shops.
Yep. Yeah, I mean, the design work we're doing, it is all machining and PCB manufacture, or circuit board manufacture and stuff like that. The prototyping, we hand populate it. We've got a friend or two around town that can hand populate boards for us as well on a contract basis. But then the rest of it's all just mechanical pick and place, like machine pick and place, and again the machining's all done with CAD CAM type stuff. But again, hands-on machine people that know what they're doing, and it gets really good outcomes. And the advantage is we have a resilient supply chain. We're not stuck with one provider anywhere in the world, and we have no long lead items. Whenever somebody turns up with a long lead item, so the deployer we're flying now, we got rid of because there was an adapter ring that is made in the US that aside from being $400,000 Australian, roughly, 40 weeks lead and export controlled out of the US. Aside from that, it was wonderful. But we, in effect, designed our own that massively reduced the weight of the Skykraft satellite stack, as well as being something we could build in 4 weeks for like 10 grand, 20 grand. So to me, the biggest part of that was the 40-week lead. We got rid of a 40-week lead, which means when we want to build more satellites, we can do this in a couple of months, not a year. Lead time is everything because the design spiral, the OODA loop, as it often gets called, the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act, after John Boyd, a US Air Force half colonel. But that loop, the speed at which you go through it was his insight is the important thing. It wasn't how powerful any of the 4 steps were. It was the one that actually gets through the Observe, Orient, Decide, Act cycle the fastest is the one that wins in air combat. And to me, when you're doing engineering innovation, the same is roughly true. It's the number of times you can go through the spiral. I think I remember a story, I can't remember where it was from, about some teams that were trying to build this human-powered aeroplane, in effect, to fly. I can't remember whether it was across the English Channel, whether it was a few hundred meters, it didn't matter. But there's all these teams were designing the lightest possible structure and all that sort of stuff and trying to succeed. Whereas the team that ended up winning was the one that designed a human-powered aircraft that could crash really well. And because what it meant was that instead of having to go back and start from scratch again each time they crashed, they could test almost every day and just keep on making it slightly better each time. And it was woefully bad at the start, but it got better a whole lot quicker than the people that were trying for a perfect light, you imagine built out of unobtainium, whatever type aircraft. And so again, the exact context doesn't matter, but the idea of if you can do it repeatedly and very, very fast at low cost, you get really good at it. Whereas if you only have one shot, you invariably suck at it.
I want to look more into the supply chain logistics side that you were speaking to. Skykraft speaks a lot about the advantages of being Australian based. And I was curious because part of me always thinks, well, if a company exists in Australia, was there a consideration to move to the US, to the UK, or another market, or is there something in particular that makes Australia a good place to build Skykraft?
Yeah, the best part about Australia is that we're here. But that's kind of the insight. It's not being it deliberately sounds funny, right? But where you are is often where you should be. Yeah, like there's no need to go and move because it's somehow or other better. There's nothing special about Massachusetts or about California or anything like that. There's obviously places where it would be really hard because you don't have infrastructure, you don't have good air routes, whatever. But yeah, sure, we could be a little bit closer to our supply chain. We could be overnight shipping of electronics parts rather than 3 days, whatever. But ultimately, these are all workable, and lifestyle and where you are is actually a big thing. So it's not necessary to go and move in order to have an innovative company. You can do this in most places around the world. Yeah, like any of the major cities in Australia, whatever, are perfectly fine as innovation places. The trick is to go after the right kind of niche. So if you want to build an iPad cheaper than everybody else, you need to go really close to your Chinese supply chain. That's kind of an economy of scale thing. If you want to build cars, whatever, Australia's probably not the right place. But there are many, many niches in the world. There's an unlimited number. You just got to choose the right niches. Yeah, and in places like Australia, we go after high value niches. Yep.
So in terms of your niche, you did speak about this with the X and Y analogy of the market and how much you can, how much of that share you can grab. I'd like to look more deeply into what's the specific plan for monetizing. You were speaking of selling to those their air traffic or their airspace managers. Yep. Is that the exclusive way that you're looking to sell? And do you potentially risk of only having one seller in that case?
One
customer.
There's one customer per geographic area, yes. And that's the way that industry is. But at the same time, it's an industry that kind of loves duopolies. They get a bit nervous about having monopoly providers because that's a license to be screwed over. But they're very comfortable with a duopoly or something like that. That they don't deliberately go out and recompete all their services to 28 potential suppliers every month because they have so many other costs and there's so much hassle of trying to change provider because they're very, very safety conscious, all this sort of stuff. So once they're a customer, it's actually quite hard to make them leave. So they're very sticky. And it's not that there's no competition. I always talk very openly with them about, you do want the option to change providers. You do want, for space-based VHF, which is our thing, I always argue you want 3 suppliers, not 2. They'll say we want 2. I say you should have room for 3, which means that you've in effect got, to use the Australian airline analogy, you've got Qantas, Virgin, and room for somebody to come in and do something stupid to try to shape up the market. Which is what Virgin did in the old days. Virgin came in and put Ansett out of business. So you always want room for that new entrant to actually force somebody out. So the reality is you're going to end up with 2, but you have room for a 3rd to start, which means you can challenge somebody. And that allows you to get rid of somebody who's chronically underperforming while still not making it a race to the bottom. So you get reasonable value for money, all other things considered. And there's a lot of markets in the world that are like this. Other ones, there's 28 suppliers and if you're selling food at a food court at Westfield, this is a race to the bottom, because there's almost unlimited competition. Whereas there's a number of other places where there's competition. It's enough to keep you honest, but not so much as to drive away all your profits. And so normally, even where you've got 2 providers in a market, it normally pays for both of them to specialize a little bit, and so you're only overlapping maybe the middle 20%, and each of you is dominant in one part of that market as well. And this allows you to have decent profits while still not getting fat and lazy like a monopolist. Because that's really what the world's about. And Peter Thiel kind of talks about this too. That monopolies are kind of bad. Warren Buffett loves them, but again, there's a limit to it. For good reason, right? I'm not hacking on him. But there's a limit to how much you want them to be true. And most of them unwind over some period of time anyway. And the bigger your monopoly was, the bigger the wipeout at the end, because you've got really fat and lazy. That sort of makes sense because there was never any competition. A bit like a sports team, whatever. You actually need to go out and play some hard games in order to keep yourself in shape. Otherwise you get lazy and you stop learning lessons and so on. And then you do go and play New Zealand at rugby and get wiped out.
Oftentimes you hear the question of what advice would you give to yourself 10 years ago or when you were starting out? But I'm quite curious, what advice are you giving to yourself today? What are the sort of the mantras or the lines that you're telling yourself on a day-to-day basis?
So part of it is to always, I guess, always keep your mind open to new ideas and to understanding what's actually going on. So there's a little story that I like telling people, which is, to start off with, imagining you're Cleopatra's chief of staff, right? So the Queen of the Nile, whatever, the Empress of Egypt, and your Minister for Industry phones you up and says, could I have an audience with the Queen to explain my plan to decarbonise the economy by using photovoltaics and lithium-based batteries. And of course, there's no end of things about that conversation that are very, very confusing to you, given that you lived 2,000 years ago. But the insight of that is that where you are today it's not possible to see that from the past. You can make general assumptions about the future, but what we do as human beings is we tend to take the present and extrapolate it a little bit. But we stay locked into things that we understand today. So the second part of my Cleopatra story is to say that since 1800, so roughly the start of the Industrial Revolution, Industrial Revolution starts 1770 or so, but it's about the start of the Industrial Revolution. So for the last 225 years, global energy consumption has grown by 1.6% a year. And that's almost a straight line on a log graph, right? So even the world wars and all this sort of stuff don't really change it by very much. It's a very, very constant trend. Now, there's no reason why that should necessarily continue into the future. It's not guaranteed. But if you do look back at the past, over time, humans' ability to access energy is continually growing. You ask, how many minutes of labour did it take to cook a joint of meat for a caveman, for example? Although the wood's lying around and you just build an open fire and roast the meat over it, it's still quite a period of time required for you to actually gather up the wood, start the fire, tend the fire, whatever. Whereas if you were to go and buy a joint of meat from the supermarket and go home and throw it in your electric oven, it took you very little time and it'll cost you cents to actually run the electricity. So if you look at that in terms of even the casual wages of a shop assistant, this is only a few minutes worth of work to cook a joint of meat. So over time, it's very clear that energy has become cheaper and more plentiful. So it's not that like the last 225 years is a break from the past. It's just where we've been able to measure. We don't have measurements in the past. So if you extrapolate that forwards, in a bit over 2,000 years, that's more power than the sun puts out. That's not power from the sun striking the earth or what we could capture at 18% if we covered the whole earth with solar panels or something, 18% efficiency. It's what the sun actually puts out as a great big nuclear reactor in the center of the solar system. And the insight is 2,000 years is the time between Cleopatra and us. So if you look at a straight extrapolation, I'm not guaranteeing it's true, but you'd be a fool to totally disregard the trend here. We are probably as close to Cleopatra as we are to engineering solar systems. Now, we have no idea how to do that physics, right? But if you go back, Cleopatra's Minister for Energy and Infrastructure really wouldn't have known about photovoltaics and solar power and human-induced climate change and all these other things. What's a globe? Like that I just don't understand these kind of things. And we often make the mistake of assuming that today we're special. We somehow or other know things that people in the past were ignorant of, but we're not going to be equally ignorant when look back upon from 200 or 2,000 years in the future. People look back at our primitive physics where we didn't understand all these things we don't have a name for today. If we had names for them, we'd already have discovered them. We don't understand them. But the insight is most people's brain, when you hear that story, starts coming up with reasons why we have to cut back, why this couldn't be true, why we're going to have to, it's going to plateau eventually or whatever, instead of going, well, actually, what if the trend just continued? And the trick really is to be able to run in your mind a series of parallel futures where you can understand, okay, what if it accelerates? What if it stays constant as a rate? What if it slows down? What if we have a reversal and we find some absolute cap that we can't get past? Knowing that we generally haven't had an absolute cap on anything ever in the past. We run out of one resource, we just find a new way around it. Whether we need to find new physics or whether we just need to find new loopholes to get around the physics doesn't really matter. But the future's kind of very hopeful. The world's getting better, not worse. It's too easy in the present. Everybody thinks the world's getting worse, but in reality, the world's getting a whole lot better.
if the future's so unpredictable, how can startup founders try to like exploit the future, I guess?
Well, but you're always looking at you're always looking, there's a long-term plan about this is the kind of place I'm going to, or where I think I'm going to. And then there is, what's a lily pad that I can jump to? I think of it as like a frog on lily pads. What's a lily pad I can jump to that's going in the right direction, that's going to pay off? Yeah. And so you're looking for payoffs that are heading down the broad path you're trying to go down. Yeah. So, that's really the insight. And you can't predict the future. There's no point in having a 17-year plan. You can have a 5-year plan, but it's a work of fiction. Yeah. But you have some idea of where you're heading. It's a strategy rather than a plan. Yeah, that sort of makes sense. You've got a vision of where you're going. The details are going to change. Yeah. It's possible you'll actually completely swing around, but often you'll stay broadly in the same direction. Yeah, we've been doing affordable constellations from space for, 8 years now. And that hasn't changed. Yeah, we've been going after the air traffic market since the end of 2017. Yeah, so that's 7.5 years now. Yeah, so a lot of these things are fairly persistent. Yeah. And that's through various iterations of launch and whatever else. We've changed the way we're going to launch the constellation. We've changed what the satellites are made of. We've changed how we hold them down and deploy them, all that sort of stuff. That all changes, but the broad strategy stayed the same. Yep.
Well, I think on that future-looking note, I think that's a perfect place to stop. But where can our audience learn more about Skykraft, your journey?
We have a website, but the website's unapologetically quite simple because we're not marketing through it because we only have somewhere between 7 and 100 clients for the air traffic management. Globally, there's about 100 ANSPs globally is what they're called. But of course, 7 or 8 of them dominate the market that we're likely to go after. So most of the value is in those top few. So we do personal sales. So the website's not particularly fancy as a result because it's not the main way we get customers. But you can go and look at the website. We're for people who want an internship, we're always open to applications there, and just jump on the website, fill in the form, and the form will come to me. And I'll ask you, if you're looking for an internship, I'll ask you for a download of your results and like from uni and a one-page CV, and that's basically how we select people. And we're just looking for people that have done pretty well in a kind of a technical type of degree, and seem enthusiastic. And I won't say we'll give everybody a shot, but we give a bunch of different interns a shot, and we do keep a fair portion of them. It's a good way to get staff, and we going back to the young ANU students that were testing our earlier payload release mechanisms and so on. We they make excellent staff, and in fact the Block 3 mission that we put up, so our second launch, the 3 leads on that were all about 23 at the time. Doug and I sat back and monitored what was going on, but all of the day-to-day decisions were made by young graduates. And for example, our head of electrical engineering is a former student of mine who graduated end of 2020. So he's been out 4 or 5 years now. He's been head of avionics for 2 years. So within 3 years of graduating, he was head of avionics. And I sort of look at that. I'm very comfortable with this because I was a senior engineering officer running a squadron with a dozen aeroplanes and 100 troops at age 24. So it doesn't worry me. You go back to World War II, there were people running entire bomber wings at that age. Sending people out who are not going to come home. We've got pretty soft in terms of what we trust people with. We should trust young people more.
Well, thank you very much, Craig.
Cool.